more percent of what I do is oil paints. And that's partly just habit, because it's something I've always done. I don't really have to think about the qualities of a new medium. I often start a painting and don't really know where it's going to go and where it's going to end up. Or if I'm doing a portrait, if a face, I might, need to correct it sort of multiple times along the way. And so it's very forgiving of, reworking and doing other layers. But at the same time, it stays fresh long enough, and you can even do things to kind of extend that you can work into it all day, even come in the next day or over multiple days, and carry on adjusting the same thing before it dries. Some artists prefer to work in layers and want it to dry as fast as possible, so it speeds up their process, and that's completely fine. If that's what you want to do, you will find, I think, that acrylics are more versatile and useful for that. And I like the fact that oils, you can create sort of almost any illusion you can imagine. You can get very rich, deep, transparent, dark tones and shadows. You can make backgrounds recede and give shadows real power. And you can use glazes, which is where you put thin layers over the top of sort of light paint. And that creates extra sort of depth and 3 dimensions. There's so many different ways of using it. You paint thick impasto so that it becomes almost a piece of sculpture in itself. Or you can paint it sort of thinly as watercolor. That's sort of been a sort of trend in recent years. So I think the versatility of it for me is a big advantage. Sometimes the way you start a picture is dictated by other constraints, such as how much time you've got, how often you're going to see the subject, or whether you've got other material to work with, how certain you are about where you're going to go with it and what it's going to look like at the end, which in my case is sometimes pretty vague. The sort of simple way of doing things is to build up in layers and let the mediums get oilier as you go on. That helps the sort of chemistry of the painting, and it allows you to sort of build on what's underneath. What can be helpful or unhelpful is that because if the layer's dry, when you put the next marks on, you see that mark in its entirety. Whereas if you're working into wet paint, basically, you can do a number of things differently. You can blend things, some cases, very finely. You can still put thick marks on, but then what happens is the marks kind of mix on the canvas. And therefore, that can be a fabulous way of getting a sense of energy in a picture. You feel like sort of, the effort and speed with the brush strokes become more apparent. Harder to control as well. Sometimes I find not notice the point where it's starting to get too chaotic or muddy and you're losing the sort of underlying sense of the structure and purpose of the picture. But I think I tend to instinctively err towards things that suit the subject as well. So painting an older face, there's a sort of logic there to doing it in layers, because you're kind of using the, in some cases, the actual sort of facets and sort of craggy structure of the face, and either defining those or simplifying them or representing them in the form of brush strokes. That all works much better as opposed to, say, a very young face, where I quite like being able to have a sense of there being a sort of like a single sort of, bit of skin, a bit of material sort of like pulled across it without breaks, which is a lovely effect. It means you can't leave it for too long, because if it dries too much, you can't make adjustments in it without breaking that. And so that forces you to work with a certain sort of urgency. But at the same time, you no longer have that ability to go back and edit in so cleanly and evenly afterwards. So, I say all these things. There may be techniques for doing this that I don't know how to do, but none that I've discovered so far. Paint is powder, and then it's a case of what you mix that with to get it to sort of stick to the canvas. Pretty much everyone will be using paint which is already mixed a bit with some linseed oil. But then you can either make it quite thin by mixing it probably with terps or one of the sort of classic thinners, which evaporates very fast and allows you to kind of work really, doesn't show the brush marks, and enables you to put layers rapidly on top. or you thin it with oils or other oil additives, which can do all kinds of different things. If you want to sort of like make the brush strokes more obvious, you probably actually then probably wouldn't use anything. You will kind of keep it sort of fresh out the tube. But more likely, you'll be using something if you're wanting to kind of blend the colors at all. The chemistry of it is that the oil sinks into the canvas over a bit of time and just leaves the paint on top, basically. But then what I'm more interested in is what effects the different things have, and particularly how quickly it dries and in what way, and so how easy to manipulate the surface continues to be for how long. And usually, I mean, unless you've used terps thinners, then it'll usually sort of keep wet enough to carry on working on for a day or two, but then it'll be sort of too dry to sort of really do very much with. Some people want it to dry faster and will add things or buy mediums that have drying agents added, which speeds it up. Other people, myself included, often want to slow it down a bit more. And I think for that, one trick I learned a while back was by adding a little bit of another oil. Some old masters used to use clove oil, which is what I've experimented with, and I find can work very well. You've got to be careful with it because you can very easily add too much and then it can take weeks to dry and never be stable. So you've got to sort of use it with caution. But you really don't need very much, and that can just give you anything up to a week rather than a couple of days. So that's something, it's interesting to try, but some people will hate that because they want the layer to dry before going on to the next thing. Yeah, it's partly down to the individual and what the effects are that they're trying to create. So a question I sometimes get asked is what brand of paint or brush or canvas or anything I use. And I always hesitate a bit with that because I'm not convinced that brands matter very much at all. The slight exception might be on sort of like longevity of certain paints. That the kind of the very cheapest oil paints and other sorts of other paints can fade over time if they're taking shortcuts over the pigments. But when I say over time, I mean 20 or 30 years. But almost all kind of pro or serious artists' paint colors will be pretty much permanent. There's warnings of the pigments at all. Some sort of hardcore traditionalists like to use exactly the same pigment that Rembrandt was using, or the kind of Renaissance, which often means that they are not taking advantage of the fact that there have been much better replacements over the years. And so particularly a lot of pigments that since the 19th century use metals, which are much more permanent than famously carmine, which was made of beetle shells, which would fade, and certain colors in the sort of dim and distant past. But in terms of what you need to use, don't worry about that. And similarly, don't worry about brushes or anything else.